The birth of the modern immigrant detention system. Immigrant detention was a rare practice from 1954 when the federal government stopped detaining immigrants at Ellis Island through the 1970s. Though some egregious cases existed, for the most part, if someone was detained, it was usually only for a day or two. Law enforcement agents would then release immigrants on parole while they went through immigration proceedings. In the 1980s, that started to change. While President Ronald Reagan's rhetoric on immigration remained largely supportive, his administration's policy toward people seeking asylum was anything but. The war on drugs and the crime panics of the period transformed the prison and jail system, leading to prison overcrowding. As a result, the federal government opened new detention centers and started passing laws to support its agenda of mass immigrant detention. In 1980, Congress passed the Refugee Act, adopting international conventions around refugee and asylum admissions, which were ostensibly, quote, rooted in the principles of humanitarianism and objectivity, end quote. It was still the era of the Cold War, and the U.S. government outwardly supported refugees, especially those who were leaving communist countries such as Cuban and Vietnamese people. However, Haitian migrants fleeing a U.S.-backed dictatorship were almost universally denied asylum. The federal government labeled them, quote-unquote, economic migrants, undeserving of relief, and developed a plan for the INS to start using federal prisons to process and detain Haitians. A month after the Refugee Act's passage, the Mariel boat lift began, a 7-month period named after Cuba's Mariel Harbor, in which approximately 125,000 Cubans and 25,000 Haitians arrived on the shores of Florida. In response to the arrivals, the government erected shelters at several military bases across the country to detain immigrants. One of these locations outside Miami, the Chrome Avenue Detention Center, eventually became a permanent detention center that is still in operation today. Anti-Black racism drove the response to the arrival of Cubans and Haitians during this period. The Mariel Cubans were darker and more working class than the Cubans who had previously migrated. As a portion of those arriving had at some point been incarcerated in Cuba, nearly 20,000 according to some sources, including some who had been criminalized for sex work and for being queer and transgender, the media and elected officials played up Cold War tensions to amplify claims that Fidel Castro was casting off, quote, criminal aliens, end quote, to the United States, creating an, quote unquote, illegal immigration crisis. Because of the political conditions of the time and the racialized labels given to the arriving migrants, the Mariel boat lift, and the increasing number of Haitians who arrived by boat to seek asylum are considered the main catalyst of the system of mass detention we have today. Although Chrome was meant to be a temporary detention site, in 1981, the Reagan administration issued a directive to INS to indefinitely detain Haitians, making Chrome a permanent detention center. The facility quickly became overcrowded, and conditions at Chrome were abysmal, including many health and sanitary code violations. Yet, resistance inside prisons has existed as long as prisons have, and the situation was no different with immigrant detention. Haitian migrants locked up at Chrome went on multiple hunger strikes in 1981, and around Christmas caught the attention of national Black leaders, including Reverend Jesse Jackson, who would later visit Chrome and tour the facility. Multiple anti-discrimination lawsuits were brought against the government for the systemic detention of Haitians. Anti-Black logics that conflated the Mariel Cubans and Haitians with quote-unquote bad immigrants led to detention expansion. Historian Brianna Nofil notes that in order, quote, to make the optics less damning, end quote, given the racial implications of detaining only Black migrants, they started, quote, detaining different groups of people alongside the Haitians, end quote. As more immigrants arrived from Central America in the 1980s, fleeing U.S.-backed counterinsurgent wars and violence, the Reagan administration increasingly saw detention as a tool for deterrence. The result was a de facto policy of mandatory detention that stimulated the warehousing of immigrants in detention. In 1983, the Reagan administration issued a mass immigration emergency plan that encouraged the building of more detention centers that would allow for a capacity to detain up to 10,000 at a time. Before his days as law and order mayor of New York City and Trump lackey, Rudolph Giuliani oversaw the expansion of detention during this period as Associate Attorney General. Since federal prisons were overcrowded, he started pushing for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP, and INS to locate quote-unquote contingency space for future Mariel-type situations. So began a competition among multiple sites from Oklahoma to Louisiana to Virginia to build a new INS detention center. In the end, Oakdale, Louisiana won the battle. Located in Allen Parish, Oakdale had the highest levels of unemployment in the state after a nearby paper mill had shut down, and it was looking for new forms of revenue. The mayor had pulled out all the stops to lure INS and Giuliani to the town, including garnering support from members of Congress. Senator J. Bennett Johnston told the mayor to let the Justice Department know, quote, that if Oakdale cannot be considered, the appropriations for the center will be taken out of the bill legislatively, end quote. Giuliani noted that, quote, the overwhelming community support at Oakdale means it is highly unlikely that lawsuits would be brought in an attempt to block our efforts, end quote. After securing the contract, the mayor claimed, quote, the mood of this town changed from depression to euphoria, end quote, calling the new detention center, quote unquote, a recession-proof industry. Oakdale was one of the first instances of immigrant detention being perceived as an economic development strategy, setting a new model that helped drive growth. It was in this period that the first modern private prison company, Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, was founded. With prisons overcrowded, private prisons appealed to Reagan's free market and small government agenda as a way to build, quote, at a faster rate with more innovation, end quote. Private prisons were parasites ready to benefit from the government's growing desire to confine more people, and were not necessarily the central drivers of mass incarceration. After all, it was federal policy, resources, and practices that created the conditions for mass incarceration. The corporate fit small government ideologies, but the government footed the bill. In the case of immigrant enforcement, however, private prison entanglements created a unique and enduring relationship with the federal government. In January 1984, CCA converted the Olympic Motel in Houston, Texas, into a makeshift immigrant detention center by adding barbed wire around the perimeter and iron bars to the windows. At the same time, the company was building its first permanent private prison, the Houston Processing Center, an immigrant detention center. That same year, Wackenhut Corrections Corporation was founded, seeing an opportunity to profit as federal immigrant detention capacity expanded. In 1987, Wackenhut opened its first prison, the Aurora Processing Center outside Denver. Wackenhut rebranded as the GEO Group in 2004, and CCA changed its name to CoreCivic in 2016. Both are still in operation today. The war on drugs was in full swing by the late 1980s. States passed harsher sentencing laws and built more prisons, while a bipartisan agenda in Congress further entrenched the federal government's role in the prison boom. Democratic Senator and future President Joe Biden was a key champion in growing the federal response to drugs and crime, along with the notoriously racist Republican Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Together, they helped pass an omnibus package of bills referred to as the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which eliminated federal parole and limited bail. As a result, people spent much more time in prisons and jails. The system snowballed. Federal prosecutors more aggressively pursued drug charges, and, due to overcrowding, the new legislation facilitated the expansion of the U.S. Marshals Service's pretrial system, which included both federally run jails and the use of county jails. The Los Angeles Times reported a year after the law went into effect that it had led to a 32% rise in the prison population, and that bail had been denied in more than 82% of cases. While the act was not directly related to immigration, it did advance the belief that pre-trial detention was necessary for preventing future crime, which is one of the main arguments for detaining immigrants with criminal histories. The arrival of the Mariel Cubans and Haitian migrants in 1980 also fed into broader war on crime narratives in the United States at the time. Democratic governor of Florida and later Senator Bob Graham labeled the Black and working class migrants, quote, illegal criminal aliens, end quote, and subsequently sued the federal government for overcrowding Florida's jails with immigrants. In New York, Republican Senator Alphonse D'Amato also attributed the overcrowding of prisons and jails to the increasing immigrant population. As a New Yorker, D'Amato promoted the idea that the problem of prison overcrowding was in part due to the increase in undocumented immigrants, as revealed by the Mariel crisis, and thus it was not merely an issue for the state of Florida, but in fact a national crisis. Both Graham and D'Amato were major proponents in Congress of passing harsher immigration laws that would grow the detention system significantly. A key piece of legislation was what many now refer to as Reagan's amnesty bill. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, passed in 1986. Despite his policy of detaining people seeking asylum, Reagan outwardly supported immigration by proclaiming, quote, "We cannot erect a Berlin Wall across our southern border," end quote, alluding to Cold War era dynamics. The push for legalization of undocumented immigrants residing in the United States had been gaining steam, especially as the undocumented population grew after 1965. However, much like the Hart-Celler Act, IRCA has a complicated legacy. While it is often remembered as the bill that provided legal status to 2.7 million undocumented immigrants living in the U.S., the last time such bill was passed, other provisions in IRCA only reinforced harsher immigration crackdowns, including a sanction on employers who hired undocumented immigrants. IRCA also passed during the height of the war on crime, in which federal and state governments were increasingly managing overcrowded prisons and jails. Senator D'Amato of New York continued to stress the issue of prison overcrowding by claiming that, quote-unquote, criminal aliens were, quote-unquote, savaging our society. In response, lawmakers incorporated language in IRCA requiring that, quote, in the case of an alien who is convicted of an offense which makes the alien subject to deportation, officials may begin any deportation proceeding as expeditiously as possible after the date of the conviction, end quote. This change in law led the INS to increase coordination with local law enforcement and state correction departments to deport immigrants. Reagan and Congress began using the war on drugs to deport, quote-unquote, criminal aliens and make mandatory detention, which had received pushback in the courts, into law. The same year IRCA passed, Congress also passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, ADAA. The law is notorious for creating a racially motivated sentencing disparity between possession of crack versus powder cocaine and expanding mandatory minimums, leading to longer stays in prison. A lesser-known provision authorized the use of quote-unquote detainers or immigration holds that allowed INS to request that local law enforcement agencies hold immigrants until they were transferred to INS custody if arrested for a drug crime. Sociologist Patricia Macias Rojas underscores the role that prison overcrowding played in the shift toward harsher immigration policy. Quote, Congress proposed deporting alien felons swept up in the drug war as a way to free up more detention space and prison beds for native-born Black and Latinx youth who would fill them, end quote. Here, we see how the snowballing of the criminal legal system that brought about the prison boom also furthered the mechanisms for detention and deportation. The solution to prison overcrowding for the federal government became ramping up deportations. In 1988, an update to the ADAA reinstated the federal death penalty and expanded mandatory minimums. It also advanced the Reaganite anti-immigrant agenda in several ways. The ADAA created the legal category, quote, aggravated felony, end quote, which applied to certain offenses. At the time, only a few crimes were considered an aggravated felony: murder, firearm trafficking, and drug trafficking. The law required that an immigrant convicted of an aggravated felony be subject to mandatory detention while in immigration proceedings and prior to deportation. Mandatory detention meant that a judge could not exercise discretion, and that detention would be required regardless of an individual's circumstances. Law professor Alina Das notes that the, quote, invention of the aggravated felony breathed new life into the long-standing frenzy over criminal aliens, end quote, leading to the number of crimes classified as such expanding considerably over the next decade. The ADAA also created the Alien Criminal Apprehension Program and Institutional Removal Program, both predecessors to programs that still exist today that enhance cooperation between different law enforcement agencies to expedite detention and deportation. The legal category of aggravated felony and requirement for mandatory detention expanded the tools that the federal government could use for targeting immigrant communities, melding the criminal legal system and immigration system in startling new ways.